from Scotland, and he is come from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and his talk today will be Wealth or Wealthier, Distribution within the Context of Demands for Regional Autonomy. So Greg, if you'd like to take the, you can stand here.
Stand here.
Yeah? And just tell me if I should. Just tell me when I should comment here. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to open the conference. I'm amazed you all managed to get out of bed so early. I missed breakfast completely in order to ever get here. So I got made up for with biscuits and bananas. Keep it going. I'm going to speak to you a little bit first about the background to the wealth tax that we proposed. I say we, myself, a group of colleagues, like Mary, others in Glasgow and elsewhere, put together a proposal for a wealth tax. I wrote about in The Guardian about 4 years ago. Some of you might have seen that. And the background to it was the economic crisis, the financial crash. I won't go into the details of that, because I assume you know it, but broadly, as we all know, what had happened was that the banks had lent inordinate amounts of money, in essence, to internationally to people who could not pay it back. That these debts were packaged up in the form of what were called financial instruments. They were then sold on the markets. Sit down, no problem. Go up and sit. It's going to be breakfast. They were then sold on the markets, and these products were eventually deemed to be unstable following an audit in BNP Paribas, and that then triggered a very severe financial crisis. Now, one of the consequences of that was that internationally and nationally, certainly here, banks were bailed out of public funds, and at the same time Gordon Brown pressed the policy of keeping up levels of public spending, although the economic crisis was producing a reduction in tax revenue. This thus producing what we now know as the famous deficit. But the policy was in essence put through internationally as a way of staving off an economic, a serious spiral into economic decline. The policy was actually fairly successful in that sense, because the economy, the world economy did not collapse. But the deficit then was raised as a central issue in domestic policy here, and this issue of the gap between tax revenue and public spending became central in politics. Now, one of the reasons, as we all know, for the deregulation of the banking sector and the growth of that particular crisis, one of the things that underpinned it was that the banks had assumed financial capital and assumed that it would make an enormous amount of money from selling the financial products, which indeed it did. I don't know if any of you have seen them, you probably have the film Inside Job. Have you seen that film? Which is a wonderful film. Repeated a marvellous interview with the banker where the interviewer, Matt Damon, says, you know, so one half of your bank was selling these highly unstable products and persuading people to buy them, and the other half was betting that they would collapse. He said, don't you think that's a slight conflict of interest? You know, the guy said, oh, no, I can't see any problem there at all. You know. Come in, the seats in the middle. Go, it's really fine. Just go and sit. There's one at the front, yeah. So that was the background, in essence, to both the financial crisis and also to the demands to cut the deficit. And it seemed to me that given, at the most simple level, that given that the rich and the people who had benefited from that particular unleashing of financial capital, it wasn't only that had produced a concentration of wealth at the top of society, but another key factor was the depression of wages and the relative depression of wages for the mass of the population. But the key result of the deregulation of financial capital, with other factors as well, has been an extraordinary concentration of wealth in private hands. And the figures for that were simply stunning when I looked them up. At that time, when the Tories first came to power in the new coalition, the ownership of wealth by the top 10% of the population was, the personal wealth was £4 million, £4 trillion, which is a stunning amount. I mean, a fifth of that would have paid off the entire national debt and the deficit. And of course, the deficit is in part linked to the national debt anyway, because of the interest that's paid on the debt. But the notion that you could simply pay off that debt seemed to me too beguiling not to suggest it. I didn't honestly, between you and I, didn't honestly believe that David Cameron was going to lead on the idea of taxing the rich. But nonetheless, I thought it was a very important thing to put into the public domain. And it seemed to me that it was so obviously something that would need to be done at some point, that it had to be put into the public domain. And at the same time, I commissioned an opinion poll from YouGov to see what kind of popular support there would be for it. And indeed, 74% of the population thought it was a terrific idea. And only 10% were against it. Not the 10% that you're thinking of. Oddly, the rich were more in favour of it than the poor, which is rather interesting. I asked some very rich friends why that might be, and they said, well, with the state of the economy, if you could fix all the shares would go up, and we'd get our 20% back straight away. So, I'm not sure what you're going to mean, but I think the issues of social stability, plus, I don't know why, but anyway, 10% of the population were against, a great part were in favour. I did quite a lot of media coverage on this when I first put forward the proposal. And I'll show you, some of you might have seen it, but did you see the Daily Politics show? I did a lot on Jeremy Vine and all kinds of things. I did lots and lots of programmes about him. I wrote The Guardian, but I did a Jeremy Vine show, you've seen that. Let's quickly show that to remind you, because it's interesting. So, the Daily Politics with, yes, I would have seen. My brain's gone, I did. Yes, so let's show that now. Could we just put that on? And what they did, they were very kind. They gave me, just 1 second. They gave me 3 minutes to put forward the proposal, and then it's discussed with Grant Shapps, who is now the Conservative Party chairman, and Yvette Cooper, and the people in the studio. So just look at that. That will set the scene, because in a way you can see that there are no logical reasons why this proposal shouldn't be accepted, other than the fact that the rich would just not allow it. And that's the one thing that the people in the studio can't really say. The one thing they can't say is, don't be ridiculous, rich people won't let you do it. And in essence, that's the basis of it. But there is a casting around by Grant Shapps and others, who are desperately looking for reasons why other things have to be done. And so quickly look at this, and then I'll go on to what they then did. Okay.
Get back to economics. Thank you very much, Nick. Pie in the sky economics, or a real solution to the nation's debt problems. Could we really avoid severe spending cuts by imposing a one-off tax on the country's super rich? Well, Professor Greg Philo from Glasgow University thinks that is the case, and takes his soapbox to the somewhat affluent area of Chelsea in London to spread the word.
about the British economy. The first is that governments have borrowed money, and there's an £800 billion national debt. But the second is that Britain became very rich. There's a lot of private wealth, and the bulk of that is with the top 10%. Remember the bonuses? Well, a lot of those went on houses like these. So the richest 6 million people have got £4,000 billion in private wealth. That's £4 million per household. It's mostly in property, pensions, jewellery, antiques, things like that. Now, just 1/5 of that would pay off the whole national debt. So what I propose is a one-off tax on the wealthiest. And the beauty of the plan is they don't have to pay the tax straight away. They can pay it when they die, and in the meantime, just pay the interest on what they owe. As long as it goes off the government books, then there's no need for the cuts in education, policing, and all the rest of it. The unemployment goes down, and the economy keeps growing. And this scheme would be really popular. We tested it with a YouGov poll, and 74% of the population wanted it. Only 10% were against, and the rich were slightly more in favour than the poor. So let's do it.
And Greg Philo is with us now. It's a good thing too, because already while we were watching the film, there were furious questions going to the table. So let's be very clear about this. It's not a death tax. It is a one-off tax that you can pay after you die or when you're alive.
Yes, and the whole point about it is that as long as the richest 10% take liability for a small part of the liability each for the government debt, then there is no government debt anymore. You actually wipe off the national debt, and that necessarily takes the deficit down. So there's a hugely powerful moral case for this. That's why I think we got 74% of the population wanting it.
Yeah, I mean, you seem like a nice chap, but isn't this really proud cuckoo? I mean, you're talking about the sector of society that is the
So
best...
much, I'm a professor at Glasgow University. Excuse me, saying, he's coming from you lot, from the politicians.
Not professor of economics.
It's actually, I do a lot of work with economics, the Economic and Social Research Council. The cloud cuckoo land is a politician.
But I think the point that I'm making is that those people who are the best at avoiding tax. You're talking about the segments of society who employ very
I'm just saying that people are good at avoiding legal rules. I mean, that's not acceptable. If you're talking about avoidance or evasion, but I mean, people have to obey the law and they have to pay tax. I don't think it's acceptable that the current crisis is being paid for by the people who can least pay, and nor the bulk of the population. It really is the politicians who are in cloud cooking land.
Okay, I mean, you're talking about, it's quite interesting to know who these 6 million are there, and you're making it sound as if they are the super rich prawn cocktail eating Old Trafford crowd that Nick hangs out with normally, but are you talking about people, say, with houses that might be worth £700,000?
No. I mean, we did this very carefully with government statisticians. Sort of making up on the bus. I mean, we went through this very carefully. Senior civil servants, statisticians and economists. So the cut-off point is around about 1 million. But we also said it should be graduated, so people at the bottom of the thing wouldn't pay such a high percentage or anything like it, while as it went up, you'd pay more. But what bothers me in all of this is not the obvious, sensible nature of this plan, but the fact it's not being debated. That all we're being offered in programme after programme is, what kind of cuts do you want? Do you want this kind of cut? Do you want that kind of cut? BBC had a website saying, pick your cut. Propaganda.
Let's put Grant Shapps is listening to all this. It is simple, and sometimes the most beautiful solutions are very simple. Live on TV, would you like to embrace this idea?
It's simple, it's sparking a lot of questions from us through the film, just to try to clarify the need to look at it in more detail. All ideas welcome. I think there is an issue though here, Greg, which I think would be somewhat hidden by your plan, which is that the key thing now is to actually get control of public spending and not just find another way of raising taxes somewhere else, but actually to deal with the reason why we're overspending as a nation, as a proportion of what we produce as a nation. And we need to tackle that as well as finding ways
But also,
to raise money.
it's just.
Your man needs to.
But that's about stimulating. Can I just reply to that? That's about stimulating research. That's about stimulating new technology. That's about developing an absolutely superb research sector in universities. And for that, you need to spend money.
Sure,
But what I'm saying is, take money that is currently trapped in the upper reaches of the housing market, which is doing no good to anybody, which is equity. Move a portion of that back into the development of the economy through this new tax.
That sounds suspiciously like a death tax. I know you were saying whilst we were watching the film it wasn't one, but it doesn't remove the key point that what you need to do first is cut the inefficiency out of the economy, the waste.
What inefficiency? I mean, I think if you get a really good research sector, I'm not saying we should have waste. Obviously, everybody wants to cut waste, everybody wants to cut inefficiency. But we need to put money into research.
Well, listen to this in between. I mean, this is something actually that you would love to do. If you were given free rein, it sounds right up your street, doesn't it? Tax the rich.
I don't know obviously how practical this particular proposal is. I do think it is right that you have to look at taxes as well as the spending when you bring the deficit down, and also the growth and getting the economy to grow to generate resources as well. I also think that taxes have got to be progressive, which is why I think we were right to bring in the new top rate of tax. And there have been, other proposals being put forward. I think David Miliband has talked about different forms of a mansion tax, wealth tax. I can't remember the details of that. And obviously Ed Balls has talked about being able to apply the top rate of tax at a slightly lower level. There are different kinds of ways in which you can do this. I think the principle is you should look at tax as well as the spending and not just have this obsession that the government seems to have with shrinking the state to the tiniest possible size you can possibly get away with.
I'm agreeing with that. That's just exactly, this is traditional conservative politics under a kind of smoke screen of what we need to do is to cut the state. But leaving that aside, the crucial point is that nobody is discussing how much wealth there is in the country. In a society that has £9 trillion of private wealth, we're worrying about a debt of 800
Well, let Grant Shapps come back on that.
Well, the debt is going to be about 1.4 trillion, by the way, so it's actually not an insubstantial amount. It's actually large. Secondly, we think that higher taxes, unfortunately, are a part of this. It's not, as you're capturing, nothing to do with raising taxes, but we think it should be about 80% to do with cutting budgets and 20% raising taxes to make this work. Your argument is, actually, it's not important to cut budgets. Let's not cut the inefficiency out of the system. Instead, let's just raise the budget.
You'll increase unemployment, as everybody says. Everybody knows you're going to then you'll have to pay all the
wait a second, I just don't think that's right. I mean, if you look at the way the government's run, and my own department, we had Parisian sofas purchased by previous ministers in our department at the cost of tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Office of Budget Responsibility, the independent Office of Budget Responsibility said that the consequence of the budget measures that were introduced would be to have 100,000 fewer jobs in the economy, 100,000 more people, they said cuts in private sector.
The question is this, I mean, it's an interesting psychological thing, but when you talk to people, even if they're not even in that wealth bracket, about an inheritance tax, a tax that they may be able to pay after death, even if they're not in that wealth tax, they inherently don't like it. They don't like the sound of it. I mean, things like a mansion tax, they don't like the noise of
I
it.
have 74% vote for, only 10% were against. We explained it very carefully in the YouGov poll. What I would say, all of this is on the Glasgow Media Group website. People can go and see all the questions we asked, all the figures. If you go to the Glasgow Media Group website, they can read it all. And next time people see a debate like this where they say there's no alternative, go there, phone up the BBC and say, yes, there's an alternative. Look, it's all on the website here. This is what the population want. Let's go for that.
Thank you very much for coming in. Very sparkly debate, Professor Philo.
Well, you can see, regrettably, Grant Shapps did not leap upon the proposal in the way that I'd hoped. But and that was 4 years ago. What then happens, interesting, I have to say, it seemed to me, as I looked through the figures, that this would have to come. It was quite a long time before Pixton's book came out. But it seemed to me that obvious that concentration of wealth, if it continued, would have to result in some kind of reallocation. And in practice, what governments did was simply to electronically create more wealth, to make up for, in a sense, to counterbalance that concentration. But The other major policy, which they went for, as we're all aware of, was to attack public spending. And to do that, they launched, the Tories particularly, you can see in that debate, I find it interesting because the ideology to justify public spending had not at that point been worked out. They hadn't, their public relations people hadn't decided what they had to do. And he was casting around, talking about Parisian sofas. I mean, it's ridiculous arguments. The reason we've got to cut public spending is because the last government bought Parisian sofas. So that was obviously not going to be enough, you know. So they then set out a very, very clear agenda to attack public spending and to justify it principally by saying that it was being wastefully spent on essentially on people who didn't deserve it. So you have, first of all, a very extensive attack on disability benefits, on welfare, on unemployed people who should not be taking so much on attached to other policies like the bedroom tax. The sense that the welfare has grown out of control and therefore needs to be cut. And that becomes and that's a very powerful ideology because it's a very powerful way of dividing people within the mass of the population. It's a very, when we go out and do focus groups, I interview people like public sector workers, nurses, you know, and I can remember, you know, sitting with a group of people. You would be with a public sector worker, for example, who would be like a nurse who very committed to the NHS, who wanted to very dedicated to her job, who wanted more money spent on public spending, always voted Labour, you know, and in every respect, you know, fitted that profile. But then I remember driving them home and going past the council estate, and the same woman then says, "That's where the scum live." She says, you know, "That's where all those people who just get welfare." And that guy up the road who's got his disability car, his dad, he's supposed to have it. His dad never used it. He uses it all the time. You know? And that perception that other people are getting more than you is a very powerful way of introducing division, alternative kinds of ideas. So it's a marvellous way of deflecting from the issue that the bulk of this enormous quantity of money has been accumulated in the hands of very, very few people. And I found it interesting as time went on over the last 4 years that people have started to discuss the wealth tax, but as they have done it, there have been more and more propaganda in other directions. So the right-wing press are always excellent, as the Daily Express and Daily Mail, at targeting any number of other groups that are the problem in the society. The hysteria that is attached to groups of people on welfare, to scroungers, to gypsies, where there was a period. Do you remember the one about the gypsies? I mean, they're absolutely astonishing. Gypsies will come and steal your children. There was a moment when that became rather popular. I can remember writing to the Daily Mirror, who got caught up in that thing, that dreadful case where a child was taken from her home or from her parents on the grounds that she had a white skin, didn't look like yours in Ireland. I mean, that's unbelievable if you generate that kind of levels of social hysteria. And the Daily Mirror had a headline saying, a child with white skin found with another child found with gypsies, it's got white skin, thought not to be, and of course they did the DNA test and it was indeed the child of the parents. But can you imagine the horror of imposing that onto a family and then all over the papers? And I wrote to the Daily Mirror to protest about it, and in that particular edition, on page 5, they had another story which had said that 50% of a person's DNA was shared with a banana. And I wrote to them saying, I know on page 5, you report that 50% of a person's DNA is shared with a banana. And I said, was that the person who wrote your front page? And because in another of my notes destined not to be published. But the point is that a whole range of other groups are stigmatized and attacked. And in this, there is another huge weapon for the Tories and for the neoliberals in the very society which they have created through the free movement of capital, free movement of finance, the deregulation of capital, actually generates potential problems which they can exploit. So the free movement of capital is inevitably followed by the free movement of labour. And therefore, migration, because people have to go to where the jobs are. It's absolutely essential. And I don't know if you've seen that really quite marvellous film called The End of the Line. Have you seen the film The End of the Line? So it's about fishing, about the destruction of fishing stocks throughout the world. But there's a wonderful scene in it where the filmmakers interview, they go to a village in Africa, it's on the coast, which was once a very prosperous fishing village. And they describe how this was part of Africa which was quite prosperous and had lived for centuries through fishing. But then European and Russian and other international factory trawlers had arrived and had simply hoovered the seabed. So all the fish had been removed. And they interview an old man in the village, and he describes what it had been like, how it had been prosperous, but how the entire fishing industry had been destroyed. And he says, you know, what happened was, we used to have a lot of money in it, and it was okay, it was a good place to live. So, but then all the fish went. He said, and our young people, our young men, had to go to Europe to look for work. He said, and it turned out you didn't like our young men as much as you liked our fish. And it's a brilliant comment on what then happens, and that that free movement of labour is then exploited by the right-wing press, and by the fears in the population of unemployment, which again has been created by those policies, the fears of pressure over housing, schools, jobs, health, are all then quite easily turned onto the incomes of people who are potentially threatening. And this is, of course, a very, sociologists will know, this is a very armed way of deceiving incoming groups. The way in which the Irish, for example, treated and responded to in the 19th century. Another key element of this, which was not, in fact, predicted by the Tories, but in a sense they almost accidentally produced, with the growth of neoliberal policies, of austerity, the bedroom tax. There was more and more resistance to that, and it starts to produce a kind of regionalism, and of which the most obvious example is in Scotland, with the demand for Scottish nationalism. Now, this is a complicated argument. I live in Scotland. I've been up to my eyes in this argument for a year. And it was a ferocious argument. Unless you were there, you would not believe the level of intensity in that society. I've never in my life seen anything like it. I was saying just earlier that everybody was talking about it. You could be walking along the street, having a conversation, and people would stop you and say, oh, I heard what you said, could I just join in? I mean, it was the most extraordinary moment. And I think it was a terribly dangerous experiment, which has unleashed all kinds of genius. It's a kind of, it's a nationalism of the old school, really, mixed with a desire to grab a valuable resource, and then covered with a cloak of social democracy and socialism. What had happened in practice, I think, was that the traditional nationalists in Scotland had taken their form of nationalism, the Braveheart version of it, the Scotland the Brave, the destiny of the people, sort of nationalism, about as far as it could go. They were stuck and have been for years on about 30%, 25-30% of the potential vote. But they then moved towards, in an attempt to recruit Labour voters. So they produced a tremendous amount of rhetoric, I mean, no substance, but a lot of rhetoric about social and just society, a more just society. And at that point, they had a tacit, not an absolute, not an agreed alliance, but a tacit alliance with a great number of disaffected young people who'd originally been who'd become the radical independence group for Scotland, but who'd originally been in the Scottish Socialist Party, people associated with Tommy Sheridan and a number of other groups, and the Socialist Workers' Party people that also joined in. And that takes off for very, very many young people, because they buy the rhetoric, they think they're going to set up the new Socialist Republic of Scotland, and they provide the foot soldiers, I mean thousands and thousands of foot soldiers for this movement. And there is a year of banging on doors, persuading, arguing, and the universities are alive with it, and it becomes a very, very powerful movement. But with this strange mixture of traditional nationalism, the Greens joined in, all kinds of groups. Most of what's being said is mutually exclusive and contradictory between different groups. So you have the Greens wanting an alternative energy economy, marching side by side with people who say the whole of this economy is going to be based on oil, we're going to be extracting fossil fuels. You've got people, Brian Souter, who's saying how wonderful it will be when we can cut corporation tax, sitting on platforms in effect, or metaphorically sitting with people like Tommy Sheridan who want to transform the society. But the slogan, yes, covers all of that. It's a bit like the Iranian Revolution. You get all of these different groups against the Shah, and of course once the revolution happens, they tear each other apart. But the slogan, yes, it's a brilliant piece of newspaper, which I can't remember the writer, where he wrote exactly this, that the slogan comes to encapsulate all of the dreams, the fears, the upsetness of a whole population. People who think they're going to get rich, people who want to rebuild the Red Clyde, or people who want to rebuild the old Clyde, the shipbuilding, to bring back the great Scottish ships, all of this. So this enormous mixture of different beliefs and views. But what unites them all is the sense that there is this political clique, in this case in London, who are doing all kinds of awful, terrible neoliberal things, or just a bad, for some it's because they're neoliberal, for others it's because they're English, for others it's because they're Tories, and the sense that that Scotland itself does not encompass all these different strands is covered up. So as I was saying, Scotland's one of the few places where a majority have actually voted Tory in 1955. And Scotland is in many ways a profoundly conservative place. But all of that is covered with the slogan, yes. Now, at the last moment, a sort of deal is struck with the politicians who are panicking. I have to say, I don't think that deal was necessary at all. Because if you actually speak to people in Scotland, if you go out and speak to people about what it was that was driving the Yes campaign, what people really wanted, and you say, well, what do you think of the extra powers, And it becomes apparent as you speak to people that they don't really know what powers we've got already, let alone what the extra ones would be. And that the bulk of the population, the sort of the nitty-gritty, what it means not to have the pound, or to share the pound, or what it means not to have a reserve bank. I mean, none of these things are understood. When I was interviewed by Iranian television there, and for Television Iran, and they said to me that many people they've been interviewing on the streets said, of course we can use the pound. Look, here's a pound. It's got a picture of Adam Smith on it. He's Scottish. We'll Of course we can use it. And they said to me, what would you say if somebody said that to you? And I'd say, well, we can use the pound, we just can't have the credit card. That's basically the difference. But that sense that people had very little understanding of what the issues were, I think in many cases people didn't see the implications of what was being done, and still don't. But the slogan, yes, covers up an awful lot of things. And beneath it is this sense of the complete remoteness of this group of politicians who are in some way doing us down. And this is a massive protest against them. And I think that's what carried it and what took it so far. But the implications of that and this notion of extra powers and the regionalism which it carries with it are intensely dangerous. Let me read to you what Brown said when he made his speech, his most recent speech, about what it would all mean. This was just from the 21st of September, which is of course after the referendum. This is from the Observer, 21st of September. In his most recent intervention yesterday, Brown spoke of the need to ensure that such policies as the bedroom tax, or indeed the poll tax, could never occur again in Scotland against the people's will. He also spoke of putting the fate of the NHS totally in the Scottish Government's hands. All this would involve a huge devolution of powers on welfare, tax and health. It would indeed. When you think through the implications of that, because in Scotland that all sounds fantastic. These Westminster bastards will never, ever be able to impose their will on us again. And the language for it was developed as a language of civic nationalism. Because when the SNP and when these people, the nationalists, were challenged and said, this is old-fashioned blood and destiny nationalism, they said, oh no, this is about just geographical area, defining itself and the desires of its people. It's nothing to do with everybody is welcome within Scotland. It's nothing to do with being Scottish. This is just a geographical area, a regional civic nationalism. And they use the word civic all the time. And everyone is welcome. But think of what that means. It potentially offers a kind of cantonisation of the island. Because once you accept the principle that people within a geographically defined area cannot have policies imposed on them which the majority do not want. That sounds fine if you're in Scotland, you don't want the bedroom tax. But supposing the policy that you don't want for your regional area, or your regional parliament, if you get it, which is the parliament of the home counties, for example, or the parliament of London and the home counties, decides that what they don't want is wealth tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax, high levels of income tax. What you're asking for is for, in a sense, to give the population of Britain the capacity to create a small monarcho in its midst, which would be a large monarcho, one composed of 20 million people, but which you could say, well, I mean, this will be a very wealthy part of the island, and they will therefore have the power not to be subject to rules of which they disagree, the majority don't want. And of course that creates a terrible prospect, because the whole point of having a centralised government is so that you, with mass support for alternative policies, is so that you can impose those policies right the way through not only Britain, but through the whole world. How else are you going to struggle against climate change? Or how else can you get the sort of global tax on wealth that Piketty is now asking for? Once you go towards that form of regionalism, and you say, well, we'll have a minimalist state which links us together, which will cover defence, embassies, whatever else we need, you effectively create the possibility of a series of very rich cantons, where the rich keep their wealth, in essence, and protect their property and phenomenal property prices, and then a whole range of other poor areas which are outside, which are competing with each other on the basis of having low corporation tax or whatever else, which is, of course, exactly would have been the fate of Scotland as soon as the oil started to run out. And in fact, the oil mine was always a myth anyway, because the current oil revenue is only $6 billion a year. It's less than half of 1% of the British GDP. This is not, would not have saved them at all, or saved us, should I say, living in Scotland. So, that problem of regionalism is the genie that has been let out of the bottle by the Scottish question. And I think it's a terribly, terribly dangerous road to go down. And very few people, I don't know anybody really, who has seen that, the notion of devolution, of devolving power downwards is seen as wholly a good thing. But actually, in order to solve the problems of the planet, you need, in many ways, a very, very centralised system. The other work we're doing at the moment is on climate change, energy security, as well as work on refugees and others. We do a whole range of different areas. But it's absolutely obvious that if you want to solve the problems at a global level, you need some sorts of centralised planning, and the rich must be forced to, in some way, share the resources which they are so successfully accumulating to themselves. Okay, look, I'll leave that there because we want to have time for questions, and so I'll hold that. Does anyone like to ask a question?
Yeah. What do you think of Edmund mansion style?
Well, it's tiny. I mean, it's one of these. It's a sort of. Yeah, there's no costings that I've seen, but I mean, the one that the Liberal Democrats came out with, well, I think they were talking about raising $2 billion. Well, you think that the government spending is between sort of $600–700 billion a year. It's gestures. These are tiny amounts, and the Labour Party is so full of contradictions amongst itself. I mean, I despair when I saw them. Ed Bull standing up and saying he wanted to eat babies, or whatever he was saying, attack children, cut child benefit. You know, I mean, I just thought, how can you possibly give that kind of headline to the other side? So I think it's just gesture politics, honestly. Yes?
I'm Canadian, and I lived for 30 years through the Quebec votes, multiple times. And I'm wondering if we fear what we don't know. And I wonder if when we look at the experience of Quebec, whether that's actually been such a problem. And I'd be interested to hear you compare and contrast, leaving aside the language issue, because I think in the case of Quebec, that covers a lot of other issues. You have a similar situation, we have centuries of resentment. And you don't think there were centuries of resentment?
No, not at all. No, if you look at the 19th century in Scotland, there was no nationalist movement at all. It did not, even as a fringe, it didn't exist until the end of the 19th century.
Well, I think as a Canadian, one would argue that in fact the clergy was aligned essentially with the English in Quebec. And you didn't have an expression of that, but it was there. I mean, the English lived in the top of Mount Royal. That was very symbolic physically in the city. My French-Canadian friends, I think...
No, I'm talking about Scotland.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually compare...
You asked me to compare them. I don't think in the case of Scotland there was a central resentment. Not at all. I mean, I think Scotland was absolutely up to its eyes in the British Empire. And there's a marvellous piece in the museum, in Kelvin Grove Museum, where about the Indian mutiny from an Indian writer saying, that there were so many Scottish people running the empire that in India they often refer to it as the Scottish Empire. So in that sense, I don't think I think that Quebecois were in a different position. position.
Okay, I guess my point is, I think it works. I would hold out that Canada works in a very devolved way. And so I'm sort of challenging a little bit why then that couldn't work in Scotland.
Well, the problem with Scotland, essentially, I think, is at the wrong end of the island. I mean, you've got, and that has been the case for many centuries. Now, that was changed with the transatlantic trade, particularly in slavery, tobacco, and shipbuilding eventually, because of the short distance between sailing from Glasgow to the Americas. It's about 17 days quicker. So that actually reversed that problem. But for a long time before the Act of Union, at least 200 years before, people were saying that Scotland would have to unite in some way with England. It wasn't just because of the Darien expedition and the failed colonial experiment that nearly bankrupted Scotland. That was the immediate thing I think that precipitated the Union. But the difficulty with Scotland is that its transport links aren't very good. It's linked to an enormous elephant economy, which is right next door. And the difficulty I think it faced was that the only economic policy that they could come up with to survive in that economic competition, in essence what they were suggesting was that their biggest market would become their biggest competitor. And what the only way they could deal with that would be to have low corporation tax. So it was the only clear thing that I could see. And apart from that, they said they would have had a lot of wind and water resources, but those required very heavy levels of subsidy, most of which were coming from the south. So it just didn't add up as a potential economy to me. But the economic arguments, in a way, were less important to me than the social ones, because it seemed to me what was happening is that would happen was that the economy would decline. And to be honest, all of the honest, what I would call the honest yes voters that I knew, all acknowledged that there would be a decline in the economy because the oil simply wasn't enough to sustain it. But what I thought would happen was that you would then get a fracturing of Scottish society. The Scottish society is not as people here imagine it. I mean, I knew this, but the Saturday before the referendum, there were 20,000 Orange men marched in Edinburgh. Did you pick up on that? The BBC, they're so terrified of these things, they don't even report it. They reported it as an anti, as a sort of an anti-yes campaign march. They didn't say it was the Orange Lodges all coming together. We managed to reinvigorate the whole Orange Order in Scotland. And we're very close to Belfast. My focus group organisers were saying to me, you realise this is going to be religious war if this goes through. You've got all the places like Coatbridge, you've got all the Protestants painting their garages red, white and blue, while the Catholics are hoisting the tricolour and want to rerun 1916. So you've got, quite seriously, all kinds of tensions within society. There's a very strong strand of anti-Englishness, which is still there. I think it's very strange if you're there, you have the experience, you're giving out leaflets or whatever, and a little 6-year-old will come up to you, covered in yes badges, and say, hey mister, do you want a yes badge? And you say, well actually I'm on the no side. And then you'll say, are you English? You say, yes. You say, see you're taking out oil. You see. And you reply, well yes, it's all in my bath. It's all there. But that kind of attitude, which is held by many adults, my daughter teaches at the school, she said, in the staff room, people would say, I'm just fed up with the English taking all our oil money and all our whiskey money and all this, Now that sense of a grievance, now it's not with everybody. That's why they tore the society up so badly. I then stood on platforms with people who said to me, who were on the no side, who said that they'd never been involved in politics before. They were Scottish and they were ashamed of what was being done in the name of Scotland because they did see it as anti-English and unacceptable. Many, many other yes people would say, no, there were English people voting for independence. But the potential for social dislocation within Scotland and then between Scotland and England seemed to me absolutely massive. And you could see it in the argument over the pound. They're already running opinion polls here. It's showing that 61, 62% of the population said they wouldn't share the pound. Well, when you've got a policy which is being sold on the basis that we're all going to be rich, if you're in Scotland, they have huge, huge posters everywhere saying, how would you like to live in the 6th richest country in the world? You can see that this is a mixture of sort of, a lot of this is just about greed. Well, when that happens, if that happens, then the potential for the people on the other side of the border to say, well, hell mend you, you're definitely not having our pound, you're not going to, we're not going to pay for your prices. And it then becomes very, very serious, and I could see that, that there are bitter, deep undercurrents in Scotland which are not what people see. It's also a very generous, friendly, wonderful place in many ways. If you spend all your time in Glasgow and sit around the pubs of Byres Road, you would have nothing but a good time, and everybody, but it's not all like that. And I think that's what worries me very, very much. And so I was against it. Okay.
Thank you. Well, there are two things that have concerned me after listening to your presentation. One, that you say that people don't understand anything, the people in Scotland don't understand what the powers are going to be. So I was wondering whether the Scots are stupid then. I found this comment a bit diminishing, because you are really, the impression I got is that you are really underestimating the ability of a very significant part of the population to express a say. And I just then would like to go into just another point that you made, very important point. They need to have some kind of centralized system to, let's say, run the world efficiently. For example, to control or to deal with climate change, to save ourselves in a way. But the question, and here my question would be, any ideas about the values that should inform this centralized system? I'd like to hear your opinions on this.
So the last bit again, is there?
Well, if it seemed to me that you were defending the need for a centralized system in order to deal with some of the main challenges that we've got. And my question is, and what values would be underpinning this centralized system? Because obviously, centralization is always, it's
that's easy. It would be the values that the people vote for. It's a democracy. It would be what people voted for, and that might include values and policies that people here don't like. But it's the values that people vote for, and that's why you have mass parties to press for policies. On your first question, I absolutely do not say, and do not mean to say, that the Scottish people don't understand. I think that would be ridiculous. I wouldn't make that kind of generalisation. What I'm saying is that when you go out to focus groups, you find very many people who have conflicting information given to them, that there is an enormous amount of information, and very many people, as a matter of just on the issue of independence, on a whole range of issues, particularly economics, and on issues like global warming or whatever else, where people are very confused, and you find that people are subject to very many different opinions, very many different pieces of information, and they find it very hard to distinguish which bit is true. Also, by the time you get into the technicalities of running an economy, if you start talking about deficit budgeting or how banks work or whatever else, empirically it is the case that most people know very little about that. They just do not know. And we have tested that. I'm not saying it just idly. When we go out and ask people what they know about economic systems or global systems or energy systems, people know very, very little in general. Because these are areas, most of which are about expert knowledge, and to the extent to which they have been discussed, there's an enormous conflict. So in the case of the Scottish independence issues, as soon as anybody said one thing about the economy, somebody else said the opposite. So it was very, very difficult to make a decision. if you were not an expert, well, even if you were an expert, I don't think it's that easy, but so you encounter very high levels of confusion. And in terms of how the state operates, or would operate, or does operate, which powers, for example, at the moment accrue to the Scottish Parliament, what powers would come, what would be the significance of new kinds of powers, of control powers, what it would mean to tax and spending policies. Those are questions which most people in practice didn't know very much about, and that's the truth, and I think the surveys which show that. It's not a question of saying anybody's stupid. I mean, we are surrounded, drowned in information, and it is often very, very difficult to make a clear judgment, especially on technical issues.
Unfortunately, we'll take one more question and we will have to wrap it up. I know there's lots of questions in the room, but perhaps we can continue the discussion over a coffee, which is at 11 o'clock.
Well, I don't know how to pick. You take two more.
I don't think that in principle that authority and the functions of authority should be layered. So it's not a question of either or. The central government would have certain functions.
Oh yes, I think that is what I'm saying. Yes, absolutely. But tax gathering has to be centralised.
Yeah, I think redistribution functions.
Yeah, yes.
So I think the principle of local engagement.
Oh, absolutely. I think distribution and working out your own local schools, transport, needs for the industrial needs of a particular area, and then linking those into national plans. I think what we actually need here is very rigorous economic planning. But for that you need the central gathering of the money to pay for it.
But the other thing as well, local engagement, institutional engagement.
Oh, absolutely. No, of course I agree with that. Yes. Yes.
Very quickly, do you think what happened in Scotland will have some consequences for English nationalism? Because I could see the Nigel Farage was rubbing his hand when the first moment of the interviews came on, and it was all really about Englishness and so on and so forth. I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think it did, and very much so.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what's happening now. That's what I meant when I said this genie out of the bottle of regionalism, nationalism, and I think the consequences are very dangerous.
Yeah, sorry, that's all we have time for today. If you'd like to give Greg Philo